Okay. And we're just sort of scanning to make sure that we see people trickling in and there aren't any issues with links. All right. See people start coming in. We'll give it another minute, Chris, if that's okay.
Great. Yeah.
Those of you that are just joining, we're gonna start in we'll give it about 30 seconds and let people filter in, but we will make the recording available afterwards if anyone misses anything. All right. I think I'm gonna kick things off if that's all right, Chris. Ready to get into it?
Absolutely.
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Nick Allen, and I'm with Proximity Lab. We are a UX research, strategy, and design agency, and we're delighted that our guest today is Chris Avore, who's going to talk to us about design leadership. Before we get going, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. The first is that just an explanation on how we're going to handle a Q&A. You should see a panel on the bottom right of your screen. You can ask your questions there. You can also upvote other people's questions you want answered. So please use that. There's also a chat window if you have anything that you want to comment to us or your colleagues during the event. And the most popular question we get when we do our design conversation series is this event going to be recorded and available afterwards to share? And the answer is yes. We will definitely make that available to everyone. So with that, I'd like to welcome Chris today, Chris Avore. So Chris is an experienced design manager who leads teams. He coaches design leaders. He helps executives understand the value of design. Chris is also the VP of Design at Northwest Mutual and one of the authors of the book, Liftoff, Practical Design Leadership to Elevate Your Team, Your Organization, and You. And Chris, just on a personal note, our team has used this book over the past couple of years. We've added team members. We've relied on this extensively as we've considered building best practices. So it's really been valuable to our team, and we're delighted to have you with us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. It's great to hear that the book is able to be relatively useful, or at least to give you at least a little bit of a path forward out of where there may have been, lack of intentionality or ad hoc approaches to building teams, because that's exactly where I was realizing when we started to think about trying to write a book like this, because too much stuff we were finding was just left to be determined later without necessarily knowing what some of those downstream consequences could look like if we weren't doing some of the things that we tried to take a more deliberate approach to trying to pull off.
Yeah, that's great. Chris, you want to share your screen? I think you might have some prepared.
Sure, I can do that.
Slides first. Yep, I'm seeing it. Great. Thanks.
Cool. So yeah, folks. So basically, this is going to be, as Nick mentioned, this is going to be a discussion. This is going to be a dialogue. We want to have a lot more questions than hopefully I can spew answers around. Primarily because there has been an interesting shift in, I think, design leadership over the last few years, and the stories and questions that you folks have, I think, will really help make this session a lot more interesting for everyone else. A lot of the things that I'll be talking about, could be pretty specific to the actual situations that some of the recommendations or anecdotes or stories come from. What that means is that I may try to also provide, the other sides of some of those stories, or try to find a story quickly that may counter what that is. Basically, in short, like, as a lot of us as design leaders and practitioners probably know, this is not a one-size-fits-all type of industry. And I don't want my responses to come across as one-size-fits-all or extremely black or white, when there's a heck of a lot of gray in this type of work. Also, too, especially when we talk about like hiring and funding and stuff like that, those types of decisions can be bound by a heck of a lot of stuff that I don't know anything about, especially perhaps in your regions and stuff like that. So take a lot of that with a grain of salt. Likewise, as well, in a situation like this, some of these lessons could probably be enhanced if we were all together in a conference room or in some type of like retreat or conference type of event. That's not the case. So I'm going to try to do my best to articulate some of these lessons or insights as well as I can. But we'll be doing a little bit more telling than showing today. So among the things we're going to talk about, kind of like just who I am, how we ended up landing on trying to write a book on design leadership and design management. Talk about some of the ways the book evolved from what was in the proposal way back in January 2016 to what was actually published in July 2020. Why the heck it took us so long? TLDR was my fault. And then some of the relevancy of it today and where we've seen perhaps either shifts or enhancements in some of the work or the way it could be done differently today. And then also what's missing from the book? What didn't we spend too much time on in that book that could possibly fill a whole nother book, or that could that I have seen in some pretty significant jobs since then that I've seen that could warrant a little bit more exploration and research. All right. So to kind of like start off with where we are, I drew a brief hacked together timeline of this book. So by hacked together timeline, I mean, any data visualization expert would probably really give me grief about this. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that in January 2016, we signed the book deal with Rosenfeld Media. And then there was like a huge lull in writing activity, primarily on my part, until I left NASDAQ and took a gig at Envision as a principal on their nascent design transformation team. From there, I still had a lot more exposure in a small agency environment out of the DC area called Modus Create. And then when the book was finally published, I was leading design teams at Meta. And then since December 21, I've been at Northwestern Mutual. And so there's been a variety of experiences that culminated in the book, and then a heck of a lot of experience in the last 2 years plus of either trying to apply some of the lessons in that book, or the opposite of where some of the lessons in that book were either irrelevant or inappropriate into my career since then. What has been kind of interesting is that what we have seen here is that the time at NASDAQ gave me a lot of that depth into design leadership and design management. However, it wasn't until I got to Envision that I was able to see more of the breadth. And so my job at Envision was actually kind of pretty interesting. Basically, what I got to do was go around the country and talk with design teams, product development teams, and their leadership, and try to talk about like where they were experiencing either gaps in efficiency or they weren't necessarily getting the returns that they wanted out of their design teams. So there's a lot of workshops, a lot of conversations, and I was able to start to see that some of the problems facing design leaders and product leaders and their leaders were absolutely shared across orgs and industries and domains and team sizes. Teams that were having trouble at 3M were some of the same problems that a small boutique agency in Chicago were having. And that was really what started to reignite some of that interest and passion for trying to write down some of these ideas and insights. And so that was really what started to change the gears. What was also interesting about that was that it also shifted kind of like, who we were going to be writing for, what we were going to be writing about, as we started to see more of those differences. So what we really wanted to try to say is like, well, why do we need a book? Like, there's enough folks talking about design or writing about design, but what about design leadership that wasn't there? And what we kind of saw was that there actually weren't a lot of accessible books written by actual designers. The reason why I threw accessible as a qualifier in there is that there's a handful of very academic types of design leadership books that were much more quantitative about staffing ratios or how to partner with engineering teams and the like, that weren't exactly what we were hoping to write, neither when we started in 2016 and all of the conversations leading up to that book deal, or where we ended up, right? Where by the time we got done, that was certainly what we were hoping for, is to have an accessible book that could land across a lot of audiences of different varying experiences. We also saw in the mid 2010s that as design teams were starting to scale, a lot of organizations weren't necessarily being very intentional about how they were going to be staffing those teams with leadership. I was a prime example of that, where they just said, all right, well, you're one of the more senior designers, if not the most senior designer in the org, so now you're going to be the design boss, which leaves a heck of a lot of opportunity to screw up, as I quickly learned. Basically, what I was trying to do, selfishly and hopefully, in a method of trying to share it, is to try to take some of those lessons that we were seeing, and try to actually talk about how we would have done it differently, or how we are doing things differently now, in absence of some of that intentionality, or in absence of some of those types of lessons that we were learning the hard way, so that other folks wouldn't make those same mistakes. Particularly because in leadership, if the leader screws up, it can obviously have far outlasting impact across teams and the rest of the organization. So there's a higher risk, there's a higher cost of threat if we don't have leaders creating a space for design to thrive, for designers to thrive, especially over time and across projects and throughout the organization. And we really wanted to try to make sure that that wouldn't be the case. Let me pause there for a hot second. Any questions before we get going into more of the content of the book out of the gate?
At this point, no, Chris. Yeah, this is, I think, setting the stage for the, kind of your origin story is really helpful, I think, for most of us. But yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, and to speak a little bit about that, I'll actually touch on that a little bit more, because I think that kind of has some interesting signs for the rest of the conversation throughout the next hour. So, in short, basically, when the first 10 years of my career or so wasn't as a practicing IC designer. I was essentially a freelancer throughout a lot of the 2000s. And then NASDAQ was going to be the first time I was actually supposed to build a design practice. And so we built that team up to about 40 or so at its peak, with a combination of contractors, freelancers, and full-timers, in an org that had never had design. And a lot of the tools that we were designing were primarily business-to-business types of tools, built for C-suites of public companies, right? So CFOs, investor relations officers, for a lot of the communications and CMO offices, stuff like that. There I kind of touched on the Envision gig, where I was primarily going around as trying to be a coach, or at least a therapist to a lot of design and product leaders throughout the country, of organizations of all sizes. And then once I got to Meta, it was super interesting there. One, joining the so-called sometimes evil empire, where I was building recruiting products for recruiting teams. So across folks who were interviewing with Meta, the folks who were doing the interviewing, the folks who were responsible for scheduling, and for the recruiters themselves. And so, there was kind of a day of reckoning when I was like, man, were my tools really that useful? Or was that just part of the problem? When you look at design at scale and the types of tools that you can have, where you build up a recruiting practice that was a workforce at 40,000 that then become 85,000, and now is closer to about 60K or so, give or take. So definitely had to think about some of the ramifications of some of those decisions in a place like big tech as well. And then at Northwestern Mutual, now my team is about 120, inclusive of product design, content strategy, UX research, design program management, and design strategy as well. So just wanted to kind of couch that as to the types of backgrounds that I'll be discussing, and the types of anecdotes. That's where they'll be coming from, is a lot of that experience. So wanted to touch on that quickly, realize I hadn't gotten to.
So Chris, since you opened the door for that, and I appreciate your transparency and making this very real, having an honest conversation, because design and design leadership is not easy. It's actually, I think the definition, it can sometimes be about solving some of the most challenging problems as a group and as an individual. And with that, definitely comes friction, there comes trial and error and mistakes. But clearly with the role that you're in now, you've done a lot right to earn that. But you opened the door in this slide to introduce the idea of mistakes. And being given a mulligan, is there a particular one that comes to mind? You're like, yeah, damn, if I could rewind, this is one thing I do differently.
So fortunately, I don't have too many regrets. I've got a few, but that aren't too significant, where I was like, oh, that's one thing that was the the death of that organization or something like that. It's actually just a lot more of the you know like, so for instance, so in my early career at NASDAQ, I wasn't even having significantly productive one-on-ones with a lot of my directs because my boss wasn't doing that. Other peers of mine didn't have that type of expectation either. We would be promoting without a strong, intentional career ladder that was not necessarily reflective of what other similar ladders in the organization that did exist were. So we started to create imbalances in what the title director meant. Was a director in the design team the same as a director in the engineering team? And when there is that imbalance, you can create a lot of churn or misalignment of expectations. So that's something that I've seen go sideways. Also, where folks have not necessarily had a lot of confidence in the growth frameworks in place in an organization. A lot of that can be ad hoc or just building something that day that seems like a great idea at the time, and you're not considering maybe those second or third order downstream impact of some of those decisions on the teams today and the teams that you may have a year from now or 2 years from now. So it's things like that are more of where I've seen what happens when those types of frameworks aren't in place, more so than one thing of like, oh, I probably shouldn't have said that to my boss that one day. That should have been an email I deleted. Nothing quite like that, fortunately.
Yeah.
I think.
Fair enough. That's great. Thank you. Let's let you get back into it. And I'm starting to see some questions come in, but we'll let you drive ahead and then we'll save some of those. Thanks.
Perfect. Actually, I will chime in on my pal's Samantha's question here. So she wrote, when you think of the type of therapy or coaching you've done over the years, how has it changed and what issues are evergreen? So one thing, there's a couple things I want to quickly clarify there, because therapy and coaching can be very loaded words. So first off, I have absolutely no background in coaching or therapy, no certifications. I don't even have a DIY certificate, right? So I want to be crystal clear here that I do not call myself an actual coach. I do not charge a heck of a lot of cash for folks because there are a lot of people who say that they are coaches and they put the work in to actually do that. So I want to be crystal clear that that's not me. But to Sam's point here, there are still things that have changed. I think also too, the difference now is that a lot of the conversations that I'm having, when I have them, are more around designing in turbulence and designing for and the opposite of that, trying to design for stability in a period of turbulent times outside. I don't think that's necessarily because of the evolution of design. I think that's the world that we are living in now, where we're seeing a heck of a lot of changing priorities. We're all seeing a lot of budget pressures. Even when markets are going up, there's still a concern that around the corner is the unknown, and we have to assume the worst. Those are the types of conversations I've been having now, whereas 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, it was much more around how do we get more designers? What do I do with these designers? How do I make sure that they're successful? How do I keep them to stick around instead of going across the street for another nickel that was changing? And then 5 years ago or 6 years ago, a lot of those changes were just more around how do I get my bosses to even understand design? And so I do think that there's a little bit of evolution there, but I do think it's more dependent on the time in which those questions are asked, more so than evergreen in the sense of how do you structure a growth program? Because that might even be different. We might even have more info now in 2015 than we did or we may have more info now than we did in 2015 that makes it a little less evergreen.
That's great. Yeah, let's I'm not exactly sure on the timing. Want to make sure you have enough time to get through your prepared remarks, but we should have ample time for Q&A at the end. Margo, I see your great question there. We'll make sure we get to it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll absolutely touch on that, Margo. It's good to see you on here too. So now to kind of show you like where the evolution of the book went, right? So it started out with interviewing designers, conducting one-on-ones, directing the work, as a manager, managing ICs, and then team charter to try to set a little bit of direction for where the org was supposed to go. That was kind of like the proposal. But then again, as we kind of started to see that some of these topics confronting existing design leaders, there was more opportunity. I think there was a lot more. I think there was a lot more thirst for information that a design leader was already looking for, instead of how to interview a designer or how to conduct a one-on-one. And so what we started to then see is that experienced design leaders were still hoping, not necessarily for a playbook, but at least another perspective, different perhaps than their own, or maybe it was going to reiterate or give them more confidence seeing it duplicated or replicated somewhere else, was around things like scaling design, or elevating or improving design maturity, or how to develop designers, not just manage them. And then also, how to design influence. How are you working with your stakeholders and your partners and your executive leadership to better understand the possibilities that can be unlocked when you have design? And then where you see like a lot of the topics that could improve, how early career managers and experienced design leaders could be doing it, around like writing effective job descriptions that actually illustrate where and what that candidate would be doing, how to say no, not only to peers and stakeholders, but to your own staff, and then to your own leadership. The advantages of diverse design teams, did a lot of research into that, and then, or secondary research, and then also just in how to present work, because we're seeing that was still something that lacked enough intentionality where you could really tighten that up and gain a lot more influence by being able to present whatever work that was, whether that was wireframes or a prototype or an org design model to a senior leader, would be highly effective. And that's kind of where the book landed, was more like this compared to where it started like this. And that's exactly was the result of talking to more folks, hearing, and more frankly, not talking to more folks, listening to more folks, hearing about where some of those problems that they were facing was going to go. So, and honestly, this actually kind of speaks to Margot's question about bringing vulnerability. That was part of the discussion I kind of had with my publisher when we were talking about making this significant of a shift when so little of the book had been written. It was kind of like, man, I think we kind of, were wrong. Our hypothesis was wrong, that like we just needed a book on how to conduct one-on-ones in a design environment and how to direct work as a frontline design manager and how to write a team charter. I think though, to more directly answer the question around vulnerability, man, that goes back to my first slide, right? Of every context can be different, because I have absolutely seen orgs that speak a good game about wanting to be, wanting to bring that vulnerability forward. And then orgs where culturally that will be taken as a sign of weakness or a sign of lack of conviction or not having a point of view on something. And you're like, whoa, that wasn't why I asked that. Like, and I think that there can be a lot of risk involved in doing that. So I think you have to have a high degree of self-awareness and a heck of a lot of an ability to read the room, and where you have seen that, end well for others. I would not necessarily recommend being the first person to try being vulnerable. If you haven't seen someone else do that before, that could be risky. And I think in a economy like today, like we're trying to reduce risks, not necessarily run into them. And I would probably say, like, I think there are other ways though to surface some of that vulnerability that could probably come across still as organizationally savvy, right? Like, so instead of framing it as like, I don't know what I'm doing, maybe what you could say is like, here, to your own manager, to your own leader, like, here are two options. I've evaluated the trade-offs. I've tried to look at the second or third order consequences that could be, that we could be opening ourselves up to. How can we experiment, or how can we gain more information to have the conviction to make a call one way or another? And that requires vulnerability to say, like, my point of view is not firm yet, but you're also able to show that, like, I'm not going to rush to a decision and not have my mind be changed based on new information that I encounter along the way. So I think it's a little bit of Jedi mind trick as well, of trying to see where you can expose that vulnerability without making yourself look overly vulnerable or that you don't know what you're doing, because clearly that's a very different type of case. All right. No, so among some of the questions that, we were talking about, among the things that we could ask about, are some of those changes around like the types of challenges and opportunities that design has, and that we all have as design leaders for building and managing high performance teams. We could also talk about where we have seen the organization really try to, or multiple organizations, are they actually becoming more aware of the value of design? Is the jig up? Are people finally saying like, well, we tried this for a long time, we hired a lot of folks, now what do we get with it? Or where those factors have come from that. And also too, where we talk about, if we are assuming the premise that there is an increased awareness of design's value to organizations, does that raise the bar for design leadership? I would say yes, regardless. I would say that the bar is definitely higher for design leaders now than it was 5 years ago, because you're either trying to, bail out a ship that's taken water, right? If your organization is in a situation where you're trying to navigate that turbulence, as a design leader, you're now have an even higher expectation to be able to communicate and strategize with your peers and your executive leaders, more so than just making sure that your designers are getting the work done. But you're also going to have a higher expectation to show that design work is making a big difference. And then, of course, also, what are some of those challenges now to keep that position at the proverbial table that a lot of us hear so much about? Any of these, Nick, that you'd like to?
Yeah, I was going to say, so the one that the first one comes to mind because you have a lot of really great resources that are available online, and I encourage other people to watch them. But in one of the presentations that you gave recently, last December, was kind of an update to this, and the focus of it really felt like what the hell just happened over the past few years. And I think the principles are a constant in your book. And as I mentioned at the beginning, a great reminder, but a number of things have changed, so this first question, but also pulling in a question around a seat at the table. It happens for us quite a bit where when we sell our design team's capabilities, we're selling into organizations that haven't always fully invested into design having a seat at the table. So you allude to the fact that this has happened. So on that particular question, I'm giving you you're going to have to write this down to keep track of everything I'm asking you. So just sort of, first one is summarize what's happened over the past few years, the bullet points of what feels different, and where people might look to really lean into how to differentiate themselves in this new world of design leadership. Let me just stop there and isolate that as a question for you, Chris.
Yeah, sure. No, of course. And I think part of the challenge that we're going to see is that some of those constraints or threats almost start to magnify or become an order of magnitude more difficult to design your way out of too. So obviously, over the last 2 years, there's been a significant macroeconomic kind of disruptions that designers, content folks, researchers are all feeling the brunt of firsthand, right? And we can look at those macro factors such as, interest rates going up, and then companies not able to borrow as much or not have the same valuations that they have. We saw stock valuations go down for a while, then they've come back up in most cases. But that's still not necessarily enough for executive leadership and boards to feel confident funding the type of headcount they have had. And then we've seen a lot of cuts, across the board of a lot of those teams. Particularly, I think when you look at the big tech cuts, landing heavily on content and research. Certainly, there are no safe havens, but I'd argue that if we looked at the counts, those folks had outsized negative impact against them. What I think that, and then where I think things have gotten super more challenging, and that's kind of what I mean is that as the rope tightens, you try to struggle even more, which only creates a tighter noose. Is that there are situations where where we would normally say in a time of ambiguity or in a time of uncertainty, how can we gain enough conviction to have confidence in recommending one path forward over another, being able to articulate whatever trade-offs or risks there may be with one of those paths. If we zig instead of zag, could we go to a leader and say, but if we learn this, then it's still not too late to roll back? Where I have seen that become problematic lately is where teams are like, nope, we have one bite at this apple. We can only do this one time. We don't have the luxury of going back to engineering to say, well, we've learned more, so now we're going to change course. I am skeptical of that. I often think that like that's being penny wise and pound foolish. To not waste an hour of an engineer's time is penny wise, but it's pound foolish to have them spending a lot of time on the wrong thing. However, that's not those aren't necessarily calls I get to make. So I think that's where we've really created an even heightened anxiety, if you will, around making sure those decisions are right, because we don't necessarily have a safety net that a lot of product development folks like us would have maybe had a year or two ago, where we could have said, well, let's run some type of multivariate test, and we'll start to find patterns that may give us conviction to go one way or another. Now I feel like that there's an even higher expectation to get things right the first time, which just obviously amplifies that threat of making the wrong call. I think, though, the other thing that we've also seen is how teams are now being expected to causally show their impact to the bottom line. I think that there's a lot of ways where we try to say, like, so what? Like, so you did a workshop. What new idea came from that workshop? I see a lot of sticky notes on the wall. To what end? I feel like where a lot of times when that book started, just having sticky notes on the wall meant, okay, so we're not designing via Word documents, right? We're not designing, like some executive made up their mind in the shower that morning or on their morning walk and said, I've got an idea, go build it. And then we were at least able to like unpack a problem, be able to attack it from maybe a new angle, a new perspective, a new point of view, and create a recommendation forward. Now it's more like, all right, cool. So what did that 2 hours buy me? What is different about the world now that you've done that workshop than where we were before you started? And I feel like that's okay. Like, because I would expect design leaders in my own organization to be able to say that clearly, to be able to say that in a way that I could then run that up to my leadership and say, hey, we are making a positive difference in the organization through these actions and activities that lead to these new outcomes that would not have been causally possible if we weren't involved.
Yeah, that's great. I have one more, and then I'm gonna open the mic. I have two colleagues on with me, Kim Torres and Josh Goringham, that they're gonna ask a question. We have a couple more coming in as well. But this question is more in your current role as the leader of a 110 person design org. Bear with me on just sort of what I'm getting at with the question. So you talked about the market dynamics being challenging, yet you have a capable team in place. There's a lot of there's a lot of good talent available. Do you see, as a design leader, do you see this as an opportunity for your organization to invest in products that, when things stabilize and improve, that you're looking at being in a much better position relative to the competition?
Yeah, so that's kind of like the dry powder metaphor, right?
Yeah.
Like when you have, can you go in with a, when basically the opportunity to buy low and sell high, right? So absolutely. However, I would argue that design doesn't have as much control over that. I would probably say that in most cases, the organization is still going to have to green light the ability to say, yes, we will build that, because we can operate from a position of strength instead of from a position of reactionary weakness. That will absolutely depend on the organization. I feel like, my current employer is obviously a life insurance company. That means they're going to be inherently risk averse, right? And so I would probably look like I did not know how to aforementionedly read the room if I was like, here are 6 new projects that I think we should dive feet first into, and then maybe 4 will miss, but I can get you 2 hits. I don't think this type of organization would want to accept that type of risk. I don't know if they'd accept it if I could guarantee 5 and 1 miss. I think, though, that some organizations absolutely may see opportunity in some of those in a period like this where they could either hire folks that they couldn't before, or where they could invest in projects that perhaps had a more full competitive arena that is less full now. They could say we can make a greater claim to this domain now. I absolutely think it's out there, but I think it's just going to be highly specific to the practice, the organization. Like, we could look at industries, right, and say, like, they're probably not going to be investing a lot in real estate technology right now. Perhaps they're probably not going to be investing a ton in financial banking systems, where there's still a little bit of uncertainty in there. Or maybe they're just not talking about it because they want to keep the surprises close, so that they can so that when times are better, they have a suite of tools that is ready to meet those new market needs that we don't know about.
Yeah, that's great. Really helpful. I'm going to open the mic to one of my colleagues, Josh or Kim. Do you guys want to ask a question? Josh, go ahead. Kim, you're next.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Chris. Chris, I actually saw a question already about AI coming through. So I was about to couch this by saying, other than AI, do you see any kind of emerging trends or developments coming through, economically or from a technology standpoint, that could further impact the relationship between design and business at the enterprise level? And if so, how do you feel like design leaders could adapt to those kind of potential changes?
Oh man, I mean, if anything, what I've seen is that getting back to some of the fundamental basics of human communication is actually a heck of a way to succeed. Meaning, like, write stuff down, like, ask clear questions, provide a clear response to that without trying to wade through a lot of BS. I've been around in this game for long enough to see the tools come and go, like a lot of us have. I don't have a ton. I think what I have seen is that more folks are expecting design leaders to just be more business leaders who happen to have a specialty in design, more so than, okay, here comes Chris. He's probably gonna have like the type of other cliches that people think of when they think of design teams in enterprise environments and stuff like that. So if anything, I think that where that change has become more pronounced is in that expectation of design leaders showing up just as business leaders or product leaders first, who happen to know more about design than other folks in the room. But that's the extent, versus a situation where, like, I need to learn X, or I really need to learn Y, so that I will have an advantage or be treated as an equal in this org. And so then the AI, as far as the AI goes, I mean, I think where that could prove useful for design leaders is probably more at a product level. Like, I would argue that, like, less about how can ChatGPT write my performance reviews, and more about working in my product space, where are there opportunities that a designer's mind may be able to spot, right? Like, if we think about what computers are good at and we think about what humans are good at, are there ways that a design leader can say, wait a minute, there's an opportunity there that maybe no one else is seeing, and that my familiarity with hypothesis-based exploration and experimentation may yield outsized results if we start to get conviction along a predefined intentional path. And then raise that up, and now all of a sudden, like, yeah, then you're bringing net new ideas to the table that could potentially improve the bottom line. That, I think, is useful. I don't think necessarily there's going to be any type of AI silver bullet at a design leader's job around, like, ratios of productivity or predictability of who's going to be a good hire. I wouldn't trust it with that yet, and I'm pretty comfortable not doing that right now.
Awesome, thanks.
That's great. Kim, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. Chris, you had mentioned the need for design practitioners to improve their delivery capabilities. Can you provide some specific strategies or practices that can help designers enhance their delivery skills?
Sure. So there's a couple things I think. One, I would challenge design leaders, first off, to say, how have you articulated what good delivery looks like? Like, how findable is that information? How updated has that information been since the first time it was written? And then can you point to referencing that in your one-on-ones or in your retros or in your reviews, where you're saying, like, this is what that expectation is. This is what great work looks like, or this is what subpar work looks like, or this is what a down the middle job looks like. So I'd start there with delivery right out of the jump. I've seen that continues to be sorely lacking in a lot of orgs. And then what happens is it becomes inconsistent. You can have all sorts of biases creep in when you're trying to have a what you think is a productive feedback conversation. And then, of course, it could be a moving target, right? Like, well, I know good when I see it. Well, that doesn't really work, or at least it shouldn't. It certainly does. Unfortunately, it's rampant, but doesn't necessarily mean that it should be. So I'd start there around just defining what good is supposed to look like there. As far as where I have seen practitioners be a little soft on delivering to like executives or at least leadership is like identifying what the heck problem they were starting out trying to solve, and then walking someone through just enough of the approach to show that what they landed on was thoughtful, that they had considered trade-offs, they had considered risks, they had explored more than one way to solve that problem. And then to be explicit with what type of feedback or directional approval they need to make that a successful meeting or event or whatever. I've seen too many people just kind of say like, and this is what I've been working on. And then they're kind of hoping for like a thumbs up, I guess, to say, all right, good, like, so what? Now what do we do? So I think there's a lot of polish on both sides that can be applied, that can help give that presenter or that the IC in the hot seat more confidence that they're addressing what they need to. And then likewise, the management and leadership can probably do a lot more work to make sure that those folks doing the work know how they're going to be evaluated, measured, what success is going to look like, what good work looks like.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. Let's go to the board. There are a few questions coming in here. If you can see, Chris, this middle one has gotten a number of upvotes. Do you want to take a swing at this one?
Sure. This is interesting. So when I started NM back almost 2 years ago, there was actually like a design thinking academy where what they were trying to do is there's a partnership with a highly reputable school, and where we're bringing outside leaders to kind of coach design thinking to weave it more into an organization that previously had not had a lot of exposure, let alone like structured, deliberate, intentional exposure to design thinking. And I think it's absolutely been useful because what it has helped us is it has given folks enough of a shared language to be able to say, I don't know yet, but I want to know more before I make my decision. Or when confronted with new ways of looking at the same problem, I may be able to change my mind, or I may be able to learn more to see if I'm right or not. I haven't seen it go awry where somebody says, well, I handpicked 3 people to ask, and so now I've verified my idea, so now go build it design, right? I haven't seen that type of bastardization of design thinking be applied, but I know that absolutely happens. I think it has to do a lot with like the way you are setting those expectations about what design thinking, how it can be used. I like it. I like having fluent design thinking partners in this org where I can use words like experimentation, or I can use words like trying to better understand and empathize with the user. I don't necessarily have to go all like, canonical IDEO design thinking steps, but as long as they're aware that like, we're not going to go from a business requirements document in Word to making a thing and never showing it to anybody else, or never iterating on a feature, or never measuring how that thing is going to be used, I'm okay with that. I think that's decent. But again, like that's where your mileage may vary, right? Like some people could hear that and think, man, I'm going to go out on my run. I'm going to think of 3 different ideas. I'm going to go ask 3 people exactly like me what they think of them, and then I'm going to greenlight the project.
Yeah, that's great. Let's do the one more from the board here, and then we'll go for a speed round and wrap up in just a few minutes here. So of these last 2 questions here, so let's take the last one, because this is something that was on my short list, Chris. So what's the most important thing a design leader can do in this remote hybrid work environment in terms of nurturing a strong, productive team? So into the a lot of tools are now verbs, Zoom, Miro, like a lot of those things were born or come to everyday use over the last couple of years. We're all dealing with it, we're all using it, but we also come from a highly collaborative in-person type mindset. I would say, from our vantage point, we've seen a lot of success with our teams being able to effectively collaborate remotely, but it is always great to have that time. That despite my editorial there, let's get to the root of question, get your take on it, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are absolutely things that, design leaders have been doing. To your point, this isn't something like totally brand new now in September 2023. But I think it's also still somewhat things that would also be effective if you were working with a designer face-to-face, Monday through Friday, 5 days a week in an office like it was 2019. Kind of harking back to around like effective delivery. Do you have clear shared expectations around what good looks like around that work and the project that they're working on, so that way that person doesn't feel like that answer is held somewhere else and they're just signing in from their living room, toiling away, hoping that what they're working on is important to the organization, and they have these feelings of anxiety that they can't connect their work to the business's value or mission. So a strong leader should be able to do that, to be able to say like, hey, person that I don't see every day, your work is important. It's tied to this broader effort that we're all marching towards. I also think trying to be able to be intentional about when you're using a FigJam or a Mural or Miro or whatever other shared tool, so that you don't kind of feel like you're playing whack-a-mole and you're looking at last week's news when your coworker, your peer, or your leader is looking at today's news on the wrong different site. I've seen our teams take a very a much more deliberate approach to even standardizing things like what's the first thing you see when you open a Figma file here at NM. Like, how are we trying to structure who's working on it? What state is it in? What project is it trying to address, so that those remote teams aren't at an inherent disadvantage to if 3 people got into a room here in New York and started working together. So it's usually, and oftentimes too, I've seen that those aren't steps that slow things down. Those are just things that you just have to prioritize doing. It's not a speed bump. It shouldn't be looked at as like a chore or some type of additional task, but something that you can clearly just get done as part of how you work. And I think that's going to see then that those remote folks have a lot of the same expectations as the folks in person too, and that'll also kind of like improve that feeling of inclusion, of camaraderie, reduce some of the feelings of burnout that they're just working on something, toiling away, and not really ever sure if it's the right thing for the org or not.
That's great. Let's take the anonymous attendee has been busy at work over here. So the question is, should design be pitched as delivering efficiency or creativity? Let me just stop there and let you riff on that as you will, Chris.
Yeah. Man, I think the real answer might be with a little bit of nuance, none of the above. And it should be like wherever the org will see the most value. And granted, that's definitely spoken like a true company man who works in an insurance company. However, though, I think that's actually pretty legit. Meaning that if the org needs efficiency, if there's a service center company or a company that's making a ton of widgets but doesn't know how to get those widgets to the people buying them, that would be an incredible opportunity for design to show how it can improve efficiency. You're probably going to see a lot of customer journeys. You're probably going to see a lot of task flows and data models of where things get stuck and get lost, and there's a lot of pain at that point. And then to show how we can create a path forward for that. However, if the organization's problem is lack of differentiation, if all of those products in that domain are all very highly homogenous, then creativity might be the way to actually say, like, heck yeah, let's stand out, let's rethink the problem, let's take what we do know about this space and turn it on its head and try to improve that overall experience. And creativity is the way to go. In the insurance industry, creativity is probably less the most important thing. However, though, I also have seen a lot of our designers get excited about the ways they can apply those types of constraints to create some really interesting ways to like get as much data from someone as possible as quickly as possible without them feeling like it's a laborious task to try to fill it. And that a lot of people can interpret that as creative, even though you may look at it and say, this is just a bunch of forms. And so I think that looking more at what the org needs, more so than, is this going to be a place where I'm going to spend 100 hours in this creative tool instead of more of this workflow tool, the better. I think you'll probably have a better mindset of how to value your contributions.
Thanks, Chris. That's great. I told you we would cut you loose about 10 up, so we have time for one more question. I'm going to shorten a question from Emily on our team, who's a design intern. I think the nature of the question is a lot of what you talk about comes from the perspective of a design leader. And this spins it around a little bit and says, if you're a very capable designer, how do you look at an organization, gauge their culture, and measure the effectiveness of a design leader before you join an organization?
Sure. That's a great question. Among the things, I think this is kind of where you put your kind of like design researcher hat on, and you don't ask future looking questions. You look at patterns of the past, and you could say something like, if you wanted to look at, if you were interviewing at a designer and they said like, oh, there's no shortage of growth here. You say like, cool. Who are the last 3 people you promoted? What are their roles now? Where did they start? What are they doing now? If they're saying like, oh, we love to have design and love to have, research. Cool. What were the last 3 features that y'all had to like pivot from because user research or metrics said that product was going to fail? And so design was able to come in and say, well, let's explore another way. You could also say, hey, I would love to see your career path because I want to be an active participant in my growth here. Can you walk me through what the next level performance looks like so that I have a good starting point of when I come in at this level of what it may take to get to that level, and give or take about how much time it might take for me to do that. Also too, you could ask questions like, how often do you meet with your boss? What comes up at the conversations at your level? So you can kind of get a read on, are they involved in strategic discussions, or are they a little bit still on that kind of like product development assembly line, which may very well be the case, particularly earlier in the career that manager may be. But you'll start to get a sense of the types of conversations that design is in, and also where design may be a little less mature. You can even ask that type of question, like, where have you seen design maturity change over the last 12 months, and what have you had a causal hand in doing so that you could see that improvement over time? And how have you been able to sustain it? There's no shortage, I think, of ways you could try to get someone to, make sure that they're, doing the job that they're supposed to be doing as a design leader, particularly when they're talking to early career folks looking for to break into the industry.
That's great. Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking all these questions and sharing your perspective. I don't know if you have a closing slide that has any contact information or anything. Yeah. Do you want to spend a minute to wrap up here? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, we're also going to talk about like where some of the what would change from that book, right? Surprisingly enough, we didn't have a lot on performance management. That's something that stays in the back of my head as something that I may take another turn at. Also, though, too, how to influence and collaborate with senior and exec stakeholders, particularly at that product and business level. I think that there's still some frameworks and again, use the term evergreen type of information that could be useful there that we didn't find in there. Financing the team, man, once you get to some of these levels, like you're going to be in Excel more than any other tool, and trying to like have a an applicable, appropriate approach to how to have those conversations was not in that book either. And then, of course, over the last, 2 to 3 years, as we've kind of discussed a little bit on this call, creating that sense of resiliency in your teams, especially when you don't necessarily feel like you have a strong footing or foundation under you, the types of steps or paths to take when that's the case. But yeah, folks, this is actually awesome to be able to meet with y'all. If there is anything that I did not cover that you'd still want to hear about, you can hit me up, email, you can shoot me a text. If you call me, I might look at it a little weird, but happy to try to be as open and as available as possible. So I'd love to help anyone out if they have any other questions after this.
That's great, Chris. Thank you. We really appreciate you being here, and thank everyone for taking time out of their day for joining this design conversation series. As I mentioned, we'll make this recording available over the next day or so if you missed it or want to share it with colleagues. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Perfect. See y'all. Thank you.